Welcome to the Deconstructed Woman podcast, a podcast about breaking down barriers between women, exploring and sharing perspectives of each individual woman's experience, and discovering what we have in common and what makes us different. Hosted by Elisa Marie and Joji. Welcome back to the next episode of the Deconstructed Woman podcast. So, a couple weeks back, I was in a parenting summit online, and the topic or term teacup children came up, which was something that I probably had thought about in the past, but I hadn't really given it much thought. And so I brought the topic to Joji to kind of discuss because I think that it's an interesting statement. I had recently read the book, The Coddling of the American Mind, and the idea that these younger generations, so kind of millennials and below, that there's a higher sensitivity or there's, kind of the push for perfectionism and, or, there's the instances where there's like the all participating medals. Everybody gets a medal just for participating versus competition or failure and those sorts of things. And so we wanted to talk about what this looks like and what that kind of means, not just for parents, but for the younger generations as well, kind of coming up in the world and trying to identify where they want to go and what that looks like. And so Joji, I think that you had said that you had a couple of articles that you had read that kind of touched on this topic. So we'll kind of dive in that way and kind of go from there.
Sure. So when we talk about, I was fascinated because when Alyssa talked about the teacup children, on one hand, I knew that there was some, like the image you get is clearly about being fragile and things like that. So then, we're talking about the emotionality or the mental health side of how do you raise children who are um, fragile versus the other a topic we hear a lot about, which is about raising resilient children, right? Which is where we're going to hopefully end up in terms the end of this conversation. But in terms of how do we create fragile children, that makes me think about or takes me back to this idea of some of the struggles we just have as parents. I mean, when you have a baby and your job is to protect the baby, I think that our instinct is to do everything to surround this child with love and protection and care. And like Alyssa and I were talking about in our like prep meeting, I mean, that's our job as parents, but like everything else in life, when things are out of balance, that's when a problem arises. So yes, when they're infants and they're newborns, our job is to protect them because they are helpless. But as they become toddlers and as they become preschool age, going to school, they're gaining skills. They're becoming more competent in different skill sets. And so, when is it that we can let our children make mistakes and learn from those mistakes instead of preventing those mistakes? And I think that's really, I think, what leads to children who are seen as being fragile. And I know everybody who's listening to this podcast can think of an interaction or a time in your school, if your kids are a little bit older, or in church, or on a sports field, or wherever. Even when I didn't have children, sitting around at Starbucks looking at the way people interact with their children, where we're not, we can think of a situation where we thought, oh gosh, that parent is not doing something well. And what is that going to mean for this child 5 years later, 10 years later, whatever. And I think that's what we're really getting at is what behaviors do we as adults do to children or grandchildren, whomever, where that doesn't allow them to learn from a difficult situation. And obviously, as parents, we're not putting children in dangerous situations. We're letting them make little mistakes so that they build character, they learn from their mistakes. That's what I'm talking about. Would you agree, Alyssa? Is that really what we're focused on in this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is a lot of what you were discussing. I mean, there is, and I'm coming back, like I'm thinking about it. I'm thinking like it comes back to anxiety. It comes back to like this fear of if we don't protect them, then bad things happen. And I think that anxiety can really fuel parents to want to protect their children far into the elementary and middle school and even college years, of trying to, like, if we could wrap them in, bubble wrap and send them off into the world, but bad things are going to happen. And so it might be more beneficial to teach them ways to manage that versus trying to protect them. Because if they don't learn how to, all the things from emotion regulation to dealing with grief to dealing with stress to all those things, like, then they just become adults who don't know how to do that. And I think that, the idea is that we don't um coddle them, if you will, kind of going back to that term, but rather let them fail and, really uh, help them. I mean, I've seen it in my own children. My children now range from 8 to 2 months, 8 years old to 2 months old. And I saw it in my oldest. I saw it in her when she first got into elementary school. Like, she came home in tears and I said, "Oh, what happened?" And she was crying because she had not done as well as she thought she did on a math test. And I immediately went out and got a bunch of books because that's kinda how I communicate with my children or how I help them learn. If I don't have the words, somebody wrote it down that has them. And we got a bunch of books about how, like, mistakes can be beautiful. And that was how I taught her or helped her to kind of realize it's okay when we make mistakes. It's not gonna be the end of things, it's just the beginning. And there I will try to remember the book and we can link it when we publish this episode, because there's this really cute book about a girl who was making she was making a work of art, and I think the paint fell or something happened where she had made a mistake and she made it into a more beautiful work of art. And I think that that always stayed with me. Even, I mean, it's been years since I read that book, but it stayed with me because it was like that was the concept that I held on to, was that mistakes are going to happen. Your kids are going to fall off the playground. There's going to be a number of experiences that are going to, in the moment, seem absolutely terrifying, but, a couple of years later, it's like, okay, we got through that. And I think that that goes back to that concept of resiliency that you were talking on, um, because we really do need to make sure that we can help them. And again, I think this is for anyone, yeah, in the realm of parenting, passing that on to the younger generations. But I think for anyone, like, that perfectionism and trying to bubble wrap things, I think is problematic.
For sure. And when you were talking about your 8-year-old and what happened in school, it made me think about the conversations that I've had with school teachers who are my friends and how much pressure the parents of children put on them to change a grade. Like, it's unacceptable that their child did not get an, and instead of focusing on teaching your child how to study differently or perform better or whatever, the solution is the teacher needs to make the grading easier. And the teachers really feel like, well, where does that end? And it's okay for your child not to be a straight A student, that not all children are built the same. And so going back to the fact that I'm sure there are many people who are listening who might be teachers who are like, yeah, I mean, that's one of the greatest dissatisfiers of being a teacher is having to manage the parents and the parents' expectations for what their children will be. And then that pressure that they translate to their child for performance. And so I think that, that also is a difficult position that parents put other professionals into based on wanting to keep intact their perception of their child. And I think that that links to another idea is that, we advocate for our kids and we don't necessarily teach our children to advocate for themselves. And so, this idea that we as parents have to rescue our children and not that the children need to learn how to create the discussion between themselves and maybe their friends or their teachers or, whomever that they're dealing with. I remember a situation, and this one I cannot get over the fact that, gosh, it's gotta be, almost embarrassed to say it's probably got to be 20 years ago because my child is 27 years old. And one of my daughter's very first play dates, she was invited to a family of, they have, I think, five, they had five children, and Neela is an only child. And um, then this play date, the oldest child, who was a boy, was beating up on the sister. And when Neela intervened and started sort of like trying to get her friend, her little 7-year-old friend, out of the middle of this brother, hurting his sister, she ended up taking, and I might have even told the story before on the podcast, took a empty paper roll and started hitting him with him like around Christmas time, the long paper towel rolls. And the mother made a very, very specific point to tell me when I picked up for after the play date, to tell her that my daughter was really aggressive and was hurting her son. And of course, I'm humiliated and embarrassed because I don't believe in aggressive behavior, and talking to Neela about it, only to find out that she thought that the son, the brother, was going to like kill his sister because he was jumping on her chest.
Mm.
And when I saw this same mom at the fun fair, like 2 weeks later, she asked me what disciplinary action I had taken against my child. And I was not a happy parent, because I just thought to myself, you're totally focused on your son who was hurting your daughter, but instead of focusing on that interaction, now you're bringing my daughter into it like she's some kind of, crazy bully or something. And I found it really, really offensive. And I also was really upset with myself because I went after my daughter to say, we don't do aggressive behavior like that. And also this lesson, but it was a teachable moment to say, you never intervene on siblings. Like, which, because she doesn't have any, she doesn't know how to deal with that. But really, the fact that you got to let them figure out their own problem and you don't have to get involved. And I did feel for her because she did think that her friend was going to really get seriously injured, which is why she intervened. But at the same time, turning that around to make it a teachable moment to say, unfortunately, you don't have any siblings. You don't know how to deal with that. But siblings do fight, and sometimes they really get aggressive, but you just need to stay out of the fray. And I don't know if that's the right message. Well, so you have more than one child. So, like, that was my feedback to her, was just let them do what they're going to do. But you're going to all of a sudden become the focus if you get involved. But yeah, that's still something that sticks in my craw 20 years later, mind you. And I wish I could let it go, but I'm still really frustrated with the way that that parent handled it. And she too had five children of a variety of different ages. And you would have thought that she might have been a little bit more, I don't know, sophisticated or sensitive, but this parent definitely wasn't. But so, I mean, there is also this idea that you have to intervene on behalf, that your child is always going to need your help. And that even though this son was older than both the girls that we're talking about, there was no attention put on what was this child doing. This, 8, 9-year old needed protection from this 7-year old. And it just really boggles the mind. And I think that's also something that can lead to um, fragile child. Because if you're always fighting all the battles for your children, well, how do they learn how to stand up for themselves? What are your thoughts on that point?
Yeah, I was gonna say exactly, because I think that I kind of see that in a lot of different realms. I haven't necessarily spoken with parents of kids who, got into it with my kids, because typically at school I go directly to the teachers and kind of say like, hey, this is what I hear is going on and that sort of thing. But I mean, it just makes me think of, like you're saying, like if you fight their battles for them, they don't learn how to communicate that. And I it kind of gives me also went back to like the concept of like the mama bear or like the papa bear, or like, like protecting your cubs. I think that that's like a concept that you kind of see a lot where you probably see it all over like when there's, juveniles who act out and their parents, sometimes you'll see them, defend them, and it's just like, well, but they did these things, maybe. I think in any circumstances, juveniles or adults, but I just see like a lot of people defending the person who's done maybe a horrific act, and it's like, well, they're going to protect their own, at sometimes a very severe cost. So I think that we do see that concept, but I think that it does go back to the idea of we do need to also let them kind of figure it out, and I am. Uh, realizing that communication is really, really important in those types of situations, but also problem solving skills. Like, if we jump in, so going back to like the idea of like the sibling, arguing and stuff, like my kids argue, but I will jump in for safety reasons. But then I'll say, okay, how can we make this better? You guys need to, what are some solutions? And sometimes because they're young, they come up with bizarre solutions. I'm like, no, I don't think that's going to work. But or at least I'm trying to start that conversation so they start thinking, hopefully in years to come, they say, okay, what are my options here? Like I want to have them understand how to problem solve even at this very young age. Because if not, then they're just gonna become, adults who don't know how to approach a situation. How do I do this? Well, I'm not so a lot of times I think when my friends are over, or even my family, like my 2-year-old would be like screaming because she's frustrated by something and I'm just not engaging with her. They're like, "Are you going to ignore her?" And I'm like, "I'm not ignoring her as much as I'm giving her space to try to figure it out. If she really can't figure it out after a couple minutes, I will help her." But like sometimes kids can figure it out on their own. They get frustrated and that's okay. Like they are allowed to get frustrated. They're allowed to feel that and then they either figure out or they don't. And if they need help, they ask for it. But I think that these are things that I'm trying to put in place for my kids, but I don't know that I'm not sure. I mean, I can't speak for all parents. I don't know if people see that or if somebody's listening, they're like, oh no, I don't do that. But I think that that's really, you know, some of the skills that I see in a lot of adults that I work with, or just interact with in general, not even work with, but I think, I see those kind of lack of those skills. And I also teach at the college level. And I am just amazed and that's actually the Coddling of the American Mind was recommended by the chair of our department because we're having conversation because I was really struggling with some of the students I was teaching just really wanted everything handed to them and I was like that's not how I teach. Like you got to read the textbook and they were like complaining. They said I didn't teach them. I said, "No, I told you to go back and read it and figure it out for yourself." And they couldn't do that. And it was amazing to me that we're talking about students at the, college and graduate level being unable to critically think and problem solve. That just boggles my mind.
Well, I think that that ties into one of the examples that we were talking about science fairs in elementary school, and the fact that you can always tell the projects that were done by children for themselves and the ones that had a lot of parental help, or maybe the parents also did it for the children. And the fact that we're robbing our kids of being, I mean, I think we're doing a couple different things. I mean, on one hand, you're robbing your child of being able to think and come up with, and like you said, um, with your 2-year-old and having them come up frustration and then come up with their solution. I remember having to talk to my daughter about her science fair project and saying, "So what's a problem we can solve for? Like what do you have to deal with in your life that you wish that you could solve?" And like you suggested, you come up with some wild ideas and it's like, "Okay, well, we don't have, that's not we're not going to solve world hunger today." But like, what can we do? And I remember sometimes you have to lead your child there, but the project is theirs to be able to then flesh out and create. And we came up with a very simple idea of, she always loses her mittens, and is there a way that we could solve her losing the mittens, besides just those clip-on things? Is there anything else? And she's like, "What if there were a string tied to it?" Well, that was her science project, like this idea, and she had to figure out how to tie 2 mittens together. It was a very, very basic science project, and that's what it was. And then we got there, and she felt really good about it because she figured out how to do it, and though I was leading her down that discussion, she was just sort of, like, figuring it out. And then you go there and there's, like, a robot, or there's, like, this extraordinary physics project, and you're like, "Wow, did a 4th grader actually do this? Because my child is of average intelligence, if not above intelligence. Where are we coming up with this? Like, where are these other kids coming from?" And you and I both know that they didn't do it. And so we're robbing our children of being able to think through different problems. And I love the book that you suggested. And I do hope that you remember the name of the book or we can Google it because I do think that, one of the things we teach our kids as they're going through school is, most innovation was created by mistakes. Penicillin was a mistake. All those kinds of things. I mean, you have to fail so many times before there's a success. And it may not be the success that you're looking for, but it might be the solution to a different problem and you might stumble across it, right? So that stumbling is very, very important. I actually read a book about meditation called Stumbling into Enlightenment. And that book was really about the fact that stumbling is the process, right? It's not about like, you see those on inspirational posters, right? It's not the destination, it's the journey. It's the same concept of it for our kids and teaching them how to problem solve and how to get to the answer. Giving your child the answer doesn't help them. Helping them figure out the answer teaches them probably 10 different skill sets that they're going to need in the future and as an adult and as a part of productive society. And so we're actually robbing our children of those very, very important tasks. And I think as Alyssa and I were talking about this topic and why is it so important, it's about the fact that if there are parents who are new to parenting on this podcast that are listening to know that, mistakes are part of the process. Sometimes I think it's better than being successful. When a child is automatically successful, what lesson do you teach them except for how they feel good about it? When they fail, there's so many opportunities to teach them all these different lessons about life. And so let's agree to allow the child to be educated in a way that's healthy and that is going to be longer lasting and that feeling of satisfaction is going to last longer than as something Alyssa mentioned about trophies that are given to everybody. And I do think that there's a developmental time in place for that. I mean, if your children are really young and they're preschool age or they're 3, 4 years old and you give everybody a trophy, that I think is encouraging them to continue playing sports. But as they get older, 6, 7, 8, then performance is going to garner rewards at a different level than when they were, 3 or 4. I think that's fair. But if everybody at 8 years old is still getting a trophy, maybe then we've missed the point, right? And so I do think that there's layers of that and there's appropriate milestones and things like that. But I've heard both sides of it. And I do feel like failure is not a bad thing and people need to learn how to manage that. What else do you think, Alyssa, that we might have missed, or do you think it's time to sort of turn into resiliency and what that means?
I mean, I can give like one more example, and then yeah, I definitely think we can talk about resiliency because I think I might have mentioned this. I maybe in talking with you, or maybe I mentioned it previously on a um on another episode. But I remember very clearly in the last 2 years, my daughter, one of her very first softball games, she had said, she had at the end of the game, she was in tears and had run up to me, and I said, "You did great. You worked really hard. Like, what's going on?" And she said, I played my hardest and we still lost." And she was so upset about that. And I said, "Yeah, that's part of being on a team. You're a team player. You can play your hardest and that's still not going to result in maybe you winning the game, but you can be proud of what you did." And I think that like you said was a teaching moment that she kind of took into, the other seasons because now she's been playing for about 2 years. But I think it's just like that's when I see that and when I get to experience that, then it's like, okay, I could have just been like, well, you losing your I mean, there was just so many teaching moments in that one thing versus if it had been like, they didn't keep score and it didn't really matter who won or lost. Like I think that she's 8 now and so she's kind of learning those things, but I think that it is important as they get older to understand what that means. Because it does lead into that resiliency and being able to handle um, you know, that situation probably wasn't extremely, on the scheme of things, really hard for her. In the moment, it was, but now 2 years later, not so much. But I think that's what we're looking for is to teach children to be able to say, okay, I tried my hardest, I didn't win, and that's okay. Versus, I didn't win, and now my world's crumbling and everything's over. I think that there's a lot to be said about that. Um, and kind of, acknowledging that that's gonna build her to be able to say, "I'm okay with this if it happens again."
Right. And I do think that, there might have been a parent out there who took their child and to make them feel better, focused on the kids who might have been a weaker player. Not that they didn't try their hardest either, but just the fact that maybe they're not as skilled as another child. And when you go through a variety of different sports, like I have, with my daughter, we were trying to figure out, well, what is your fit? And so she played volleyball and soccer and, all these different sports, and it's like she wasn't good at everything. There were lots of things she was not good at. And, part of the difficulty was being able to say to her, if you're not going to give 100%, then don't, you have to be a team player. You have to. And there are I saw lots of behavior on the sidelines with parents who were yelling at other children or yelling at their kid or, wanting to skip a child because you knew that person was going to make the third out, or whatever. And it's heartbreaking because that's not what the sport is there for. The sport is there to grow everybody and to teach them. And, Neela went through a ton of different sports because it took us a long time to find something that she was good at. And that's all we were doing. We were not trying to raise an NBA player. We were just simply trying to expose her to all the different things so that she could figure out like what did she like and what did she not like. But then you get that competitive, not obviously at 8 years old, maybe, but even there were some younger children's parents who you could tell that they were blaming the weak child, and that weakness is just part of being on a team. I mean, unless you can control your whole destiny by being like a golf player or something, and honing your own skills. I mean, you're really against you're playing as a team, and that's an important lesson. And I think that's where I think for me as a parent, that's the most important thing is that exactly what you're doing. And gosh, I mean, your kids are going to be so resilient, Alyssa, because you do take every opportunity to teach them. And it's so hard when your child is crying their eyes out and they're so frustrated not to sympathize with them only, but to be able to say, yeah, that's life to an 8-year old and whatever, however you have to say that. I mean, it's such a beautiful thing and it's going to serve them so well. And so, you don't need a pat on the back, but it just makes me feel like that's such a warm, rich experience for you and your child because you are like just getting everything out of it that you can and making them resilient. And so let's define resiliency. So resiliency is the ability to bounce back after a difficult situation. And so we know people like that. We know adults who have a hard time with resilience. And we also know children who do. And so everything that we're doing to raise our kids is about increasing their resiliency so that they're not stripped of their ego or their self-confidence when something doesn't go their way. How else would you add to that definition of resiliency, Alyssa? Putting it into terms that maybe I'm not using.
I think I mean, I think that that's a great definition, and I'm trying to think of any other way that I would phrase it, but I mean, I think that being able to bounce back from difficult situations, and then there's also like the learning piece of it too, or the ability to integrate that into like how they view future situations. Like I think that it's not just in that like if a hard situation happens and a child is resilient, I think that, or a child or adult, whomever the person is, I think they also, that resiliency helps them in future situations. And I think that so it's a kind of an ongoing process, not just a one time thing, but something that occurs over and over again as they experience different things throughout their lifetime. But I think that would be the only thing that I would add to it.
And as I was just looking up while you were talking about, you were adding your input, the one other thing that I see that's mentioned is just about being able to look at it in a positive way so that it's not like something negative happens and then you go down this, path of you're a horrible person and then you feel terrible about yourself, that you're able to find some balance in the experience to be like, and it's not the end of the world. Right. And I think that's really important as we look at the last podcast that we published was on regrets. And I do think that people who are able to move past regret are people who are able to be resilient and say that that one experience is not going to hold you back, right? And some people get stuck with regrets and they just are there and everything is colored by it. Whereas with resiliency, it's really being able to look at it as one data point, one slice of time, and that you're able to look at it compared to the rest of the experience. And so that it's not that one experience has the power to destroy, your impression of your accomplishment or yourself, but that it's just one situation that you can rise above. And so being able to look at it in perspective and to have that flexibility of thought, I think is also a key component of resiliency so that, we're building children who have the ability to move forward and continue on their path without, really feeling anxious or stuck or depressed. All the things that, we talk about when you don't feel successful and it's not a repeating cycle. You're able to see it as just a simple situation, not a pattern of negativity that can really bring you down or hold you down for a long time. So I think being able to be that flexibility or having flexible thought, being positive and being able to say, okay, the next time I might do differently, right? I mean, the outcome might be different and I may have to practice more. I may have to try harder. I may have to study longer. I may have to read the book. I mean, whatever it is, but that you're going to understand it differently the next time. And so I do think that's also important um, about it. And so I don't know. Anything else we want to say before we end this podcast?
I don't think I have anything specific because I think that we've covered a lot of ground, and kind of given a taste of this. I know that we're going to, in the next, couple of episodes, kind of have a continuation of this conversation. In some ways, kind of bring it, kind of going further back, and looking generationally at different viewpoints, regarding like volunteering and things like that. And so I think that it's kind of going to be like it's not necessarily a segment, segmented episodes, but I think that we are going to kind of look at this from a lot of different perspectives. And so obviously this is from ours, and then bringing in somebody, maybe from an older generation, maybe somebody from a younger generation, and kind of putting it all together. So be sure to listen in, for that as well, because we're going to kind of continue the conversation, but just with a different, kind of different perspectives, if you will.
Yep. So this is Joji and Alyssa signing off today. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and hopefully it brought some a different perspective or helped you look at it from a different way. As always, we're very interested to hear your feedback. Please drop us a line at our Gmail address or our Facebook page. And we thank you again for participating with the Deconstructed Woman. Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to our podcast, The Deconstructed Woman. If you liked this podcast, please share it with your friends, rate this episode, or subscribe to be notified of all new content. We want to hear from you, our listener. Do you have thoughts on the discussions we're having? Want to share topic suggestions? Or want to join us for a topic that you're passionate about? Contact us at our email address, thedeconstructedwoman@gmail.com.